Hello. Well, thank you very much for logging in to this Farnham Society in Conversation. And as many of you will know, we started these at the end of last year. And some of you, therefore, may already have seen what I'm grandly calling our first series. And we've been encouraged with the reaction to that first series to produce some more. And so you join us today on the first of our next series of In Conversations, this being the first. But the objective of these In Conversations remains the same. And perhaps it's best summarized by saying we just want to highlight well-known people and particular organizations of Farnham and tell their stories, because both people and organizations help make Farnham the place it is today and which we enjoy. Now, today's conversation covers both the people and the organisation. And to a certain extent, right at the centre of that is the heritage, which in the Farnham Society is one of our objectives to improve and enhance, and which makes Farnham the place we enjoy today. So I'm particularly delighted to introduce Josh Godfrey. Josh is the curator of the Museum of Farnham. So Josh, hello and welcome.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm good, and you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Thanks for having
Very
me.
good. Well, thank you for doing this with us today. And you and I have met previously, and it was good of you to consent to this. And I was fascinated to hear some of the early story of the Museum of Farnham, and we'll get into that in a moment. But I think you're relatively recent into the role as curator, aren't you, at Farnham?
Yeah, so I began here in December 2018. So it would have been a solid 2 and a bit years by now, but 9 months of that was largely lost to COVID and being furloughed. So it doesn't feel like 2.5 years into a role like it might do.
No, I know what that might feel like. And of course, you've only been reopened since when? Is it May or
So
was it earlier you opened? I'm sorry, when?
May the 17th was when we reopened this
May
year.
the 17th. Yeah. Well, let's start with perhaps for those that are unaware, understanding, where the Museum of Farnham sits, because I think since relatively recently, 2011, 2012, it's been part of the Farnham Maltings. I mean, I think it goes back to 1961, but it's since, am I right? 2011, 2012, part of the Farnham Maltings?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it was 2011/12 where Waverley Borough Council, it was a local authority and museum with them. They were looking at the costs of running it, and it was becoming almost insurmountable for them to continue on. And Gavin Stride, director, CEO of the Maltings, saw the opportunity to bring the kind of arts and theatre sector and the heritage sector together and experiment with how that might work. And what there is now is an agreement with Waverley and the Farnham Maltings for the Maltings to take on running the museum service, and that's been in place ever since. And the reason I make it clear that it's the service that the Maltings run is that the building itself is still owned by Waverley Borough Council.
Right. Well, we might come to that in a moment, because I'm mindful that it's got all the scaffolding out the front, and I'm sure there's a story worth telling that sits behind that. But in terms of the way you've just described that organisation, does the funding therefore simply rely on the route from the Maltings, or is there still any independent funding into the Museum of Farnham?
Okay, so based on our annual budget, I'd say about 60% of that comes from a grant fund, which is given to the Maltings to run the museum. However, the other 40% is completely self-generated. So we have our garden gallery space as an asset for venue hire. Our education service produces a small amount of that. Our shop, we're trying to develop a better cafe offer. So sustainability is obviously a key message across the heritage sector, and that is looking at museums and how they might become more business-like.
I mean, what you describe with the arrangement with the Maltings taking over the museum in the way that you describe, that seems a very good fit. Are other local museums organised in the same way, or is this something particular to Waverley and Farnham Maltings and Farnham Museum?
That's a great question, and I think half of the reason they did it is because there's not many examples around the country of in arts and theatre and a heritage organisation combining. I know there's a few, and when you think about it, it is a natural fit. So it's quite odd to think that we don't have lots of examples to look at. So it's definitely unique within this borough. It's definitely unique within Surrey, we think. But there are some other examples of museums and theatres coming together as organisations across the country.
I mean, you mentioned arts and, arts and craft. I think some of the collection at the museum, is about the arts and craft heritage of Farnham itself.
Well, precisely. So you've got the amazing history of the castle and Redgrave theatres in Farnham. We hold the archives around both those buildings. The plays, you talk about the art and the craft here. We've got a massive art collection. One or two good, what you might call celebrity names, but nothing much. And that's quite unique in its own sense. It's about Farnham by the people of Farnham. And again, with the craft, we've obviously got a potting history in Farnham, all right through from the Roman times, even medieval kilns in the sites and areas. So crafting is part of our heritage, and the museum holds those collections that can help kind of support that story.
I ventured out this morning for a coffee, trying to get back to normal, if I can put it like that. But I've ventured out already, don't you? So,
yeah.
But I hadn't been to the Farnham pottery, and I picked up a book written by somebody who lives outside Luton, so not a local person, who wrote the history of the Farnham pottery, and in it talks about the Museum of Farnham holding a collection of, items from the Farnham pottery going back in time, certainly back to the 19th century. So there's that link, isn't there, with other organisations in Farnham?
Exactly, and this is that link is something that we try to develop in areas where we have links with the collection and other businesses. But that one specifically is about the greenware, which is the most well-known kind of production from that pottery. And it's currently on display, most of it.
Is it? Oh, excellent. Yeah. Now, I'm itching to ask you about the building, because when we first met, I ducked under the scaffolding and came into the building. But two things really about the building. One, it's a museum piece in its own right. That's a bit of a stretch, but you can tell me about that in a moment. And then we'll move on to the scaffolding. But the building itself is rather special, isn't it?
Yeah, so the reason that building is so special, it's a Grade 1 listed building with English heritage, which is important in its own right. And the reason it's been listed is because as a Georgian piece of architecture, and specifically the parapet at the top and the frontage, it's an incredible example of Georgian architecture and the work. So that's been recognised by many people. The local historian Nigel Temple wrote about the architecture of the building in some of his earlier books. When I first came, I was anecdotally told that the Georgian Society in London say it's the best example of Georgian architecture outside of London. And of course, within the four walls itself, it holds an incredible history and tells a story about Farnham itself. And what I mean by that is the original owner of the house, John Thorne, who built it in 1718, was a hopster, grew the hops, and any person, I'd say, who spent some time in Farnham or lived in Farnham for at least over a year would become very quickly aware of the history and heritage of hop farms and the brewing industry in the area. So this building itself lends itself nicely to telling the story of probably Farnham's most prosperous period and how it came into existence as it is.
Well, I was going to ask you, we talk about the Georgian period, and forgive me for asking such a basic question, but actually what you've identified is early Georgian, isn't it? 1718? That's a pretty early stage. Yeah. And of course, what you also refer to is that hops was the essential wealth generation of Farnham, because they were not, inexpensive buildings to have designed and built, presumably. And the next door property is similar, isn't it?
Yeah, Sandford House next door is very much the same. In fact, most of West Street has been developed. As you walk down West Street, you can see a lot of the Georgian architecture. It became the kind of growth area of the town, it seems, during that period. The centre of town, Castle Street and the borough was well founded, but as the hops trade expanded, so did this street. And you look at earlier maps of the centre of Farnham, and you've got your house, and then your hop fields are directly behind what we now know as kind of the centre of town. So it shows you how integral it was to people's livelihoods, and not just those that built these great big houses, but those who came and relied on picking the hops as an income from all over the area.
So what would we have done without beer? Now, you talked about one of the notable features being the parapet, but I seem to recall inside, isn't the staircase a particular example to highlight as well?
Yeah, interesting it is. And I was speaking to my neighbour yesterday. We talked about Sanford House with this the other day, and she mentioned that it's potential that the two staircases from these houses came from a larger estate from the same property and were divided in two by and put into these two properties. I don't know. That's an unfounded claim, but it's definitely a very unique um, design in terms of the woodwork and the craftsmanship that's gone into it. So rather beautiful.
So it brings me, doesn't it, to the scaffolding outside your
Yeah.
side and not your neighbours. So it's been up there some time. So what's the story about the scaffolding?
Okay, so the story behind the scaffolding is quite simple. A structural engineer has come out to the building at some point and identified a weakness in the mortar lines and the bricks up the top. And as Waverley Borough Council have rightfully done, they've taken on their due diligence, seen the risk, and the scaffolding's been put up as a safety measure to protect anybody from falling debris. But upon that engineer's report then going back and the scaffolding being put up, you start to investigate what it would take to fix the building, and that has come at a considerable cost. And it's come at a time where Waverley were trying to A, first find how to fund it, and B, COVID's just hit, which has only exacerbated the issue. And what makes it so difficult is that they are what they call lime mortar bricks, which means they're made in a particular way. They can only be set at a certain time of year, and there's only a handful of people in the country that can actually do this. So not just one or two unique parts to making it, but the entire process in itself is unique.
And therefore, when I said the building itself is like a museum piece, actually the way it's built harks back to that as well. So we'll maybe come back to some of that, because I do want to get into the collections, very essence of a museum. So tell me about the collections and the archives, and actually the library where I think you're sitting at the moment. So what are the collections as you would describe them to somebody not aware of the Museum of Farnham and what it has to offer?
Wow, great. That's never been asked to do this. So let's see what we come out with. Well, quite simply, we are a social history collection overall, which means that we have within our collection objects, artifacts, newspapers, anything that can help tell the story of those that have lived in Farnham, and sometimes a little bit wider because earlier curators didn't focus so much on the town. But they then can be divided into the areas of art, textiles and costume. We have a wonderful textiles and costume collection which dates back to in some areas the Georgian period, but late Georgian. Craft and art, pottery, that's another section. And then within it, kind of medicine, religious, commercial. It's obviously quite an eclectic social history collection, and it does record the town's history very well.
That's fantastic for a relatively small town like Farnham to have that sort of archive, collection, particularly as it resonates so strongly. You talk about costume, you talk about arts and crafts, and here we are with the University of the Creative Arts in our midst. So it links well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's there to be utilised, and it's something that we're keen to do more of. It's a collection that's been it's about 20,000 objects in total, and that's probably without even considering the archive, which will surmount it to even more, because you can fit so many more pieces of paper in a box than you can an old set of scales.
Right.
But it's there as a resource.
And you refer to a resource. I looked at the website, and actually you have sort of a rather grand lending library. You can loan out or have loan boxes, can't you? This is one of the services that you offer?
Okay, yeah. So as a museum, we offer a variety of services. And I think what you're referring to first is from our education standpoint, we have loan boxes which go out to teachers, and they are a teaching aid that go into classes, allow kids to often handle replica objects, if not sometimes real objects, depending on the robustness. When you speak of the library, we have a wonderful learning library. It's known as the Manning Library. And within that, there is a series of books that relate to Farnham, local villages, maps of the local area. And it's a great resource for people to come and access in terms of family history or researching the local area itself. We also keep a lot of press cuttings around topics we think are interesting. So the well-known lady Jean Parrott from the area did a book on pubs, and we have a lot of the original kind of research into that book. And we
did a book on pubs or in pubs?
Well, I don't know. Where she wrote it was up to her. I certainly would have been in the pub writing about pubs.
Quite right, quite. But I mean, do you think enough people know about this, or is it just me that's sort of come across this aspect of our heritage more recently? I mean, do you get good demand for what you offer there?
That's an interesting question, and the answer is broadly yes, but in certain areas no. So the library is definitely an asset that's used, but not well enough. We'd love to promote it. Our education service, I touched on the loan boxes, but we also do outreach to schools and have schools here, is definitely quite well known with local schools, and we slowly try to expand it a little bit further into Surrey. But the museum as a whole isn't very well known, and that's one of our biggest challenges, that we are an organisation that has existed within Farnham, but has perhaps had a very simple vision of itself, and we are now looking to expand that vision and kind of challenge the status quo of what a traditional museum is within a local town, because speaking nationally, local history museums face an uphill battle to survive, quite frankly. And if they do, a lot of them will be absorbed into bigger kind of cultural trusts. So we in Farnham, kind of along the direction of the Maltings and the support of Waverley Borough, we want to look at what that model can be and how we can define it a bit more and develop it into something that's meaningful to a town. And to be honest, Farnham, we feel, reacts as a community to things like this. So we're hoping that through our work, we're embraced with open arms.
And of course, Farnham is expanding, isn't it? I mean, let's talk a little bit about the future, but I guess we can't pass the last 18 months, because this must have been incredibly difficult. You've had to close, and that's, like all these organizations, had an impact on, well, on income, of course, but on people and no doubt the team. So I presume you've had to cope with this as best you can.
Absolutely. I think, we were all furloughed as a team, and quite rightly so. It was there to protect the business, and it was done well. And I think what Gavin did in particular at the Farnham Maltings, kind of making a community centre, was where the focus was for the entire organisation, because it's important to remember we are part of the Maltings. So we took away, but there's also this unique identity for us where we are still a sub-organisation as the museum. And I feel that what we perhaps lost, like of other local small businesses would have done, is you lost your publicity and your face and people knowing about you. So it's been quite reassuring to come back in, and even within the COVID safe measures, we've had sell-out children's events, only 10 to 12 people allowed, but people are still knowing that we're here and know the offer that we've got. And it was fortunate to have a team who were very resilient in the way that they acted. And then when they came back, they took on the challenges that were presented to us. So we're by no means out of the woods, but we're optimistic about where we can get to.
You mentioned the garden. Surely one of the really special features of the Museum of Farnham is its walled garden and the gallery facility you have in there. I mean, do you just want to say a few words about that? I mean, how do you keep that going? And presumably you've reopened the gallery, and you're starting to get booked events again.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the gallery first. The gallery's been very difficult to manage, but with it, we're really lucky that we've worked with a lot of good regular hirers who respect the space and have respected our need as a venue to follow COVID restrictions and make sure everything's been done in a safe manner. So that business is allowed to kind of operate at kind of 25 to 30% in the first quarter of this year. And you have to think the first 6 weeks of the year financially were wiped out by us not being open at all. So it's bounced back well, and we're looking forward to the 19th of July. I've definitely seen a surge in bookings, or at least potential bookings, coming through. And that space is a huge benefit to the museum, but it's also a huge benefit to the community. It's very unique. As you say, we have a beautiful garden it's surrounded by. So it competes quite well in terms of venue hire and that business. The garden itself is probably our biggest asset. We have an amazing museum, but there's lots to be done, whereas the garden has been very well taken care of by my assistant curator, Sam, who's recently just moved on to a new role in a new organisation up north. But he took such great care of that garden and fostered some amazing garden volunteers who provide regular effort to keep it the way it is. And we've just this year looked at it as an asset, and we've just recently ran 2 events that have been highly successful within that space, and again within COVID measures. So we hope that we can replicate them into the future, but with greater income generation for the museum itself.
And of course, for those that don't know, it's a modern venue, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't date back very far, does it? The building itself.
2008. Yeah, 2008. It was open to the public.
Yeah.
You know, an amazing space and
Mm.
very versatile, I think, is what lends it makes it such a nice space to hire.
I feel as though I'm doing a bit of a publicity here for the museum, but there's no
Yeah,
harm in that. Well, there's no
no,
harm in
absolutely
that, is
not.
there?
No, absolutely not. And you know, it's when we kind of spoke briefly about what we're going to talk about. It was nice that you mentioned it. Museums are about the collections at the core, and I think that's something I wanted to make sure I get across, that an organization as a museum is the collection, and that can be quite difficult maybe to understand from the outside looking in. And it's our job to make sure that that collection remains relevant even to today.
Mm.
And how you do that is working greater within the community. There's been a huge transition in the way museums have operated in the last 20 years. They realized they could no longer be academic institutions because that only applied to a very small percentile of the population, whereas museums are spaces for everybody now. And we are slowly transitioning from a traditional model to a more modern one.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of conversations I've had with some of our colleagues from the church who are looking at church buildings in a different way as community spaces as well. Coming back to the garden, I was interested to see that you host a series of summer events. Yeah. Well, then it quickly switches to the Maltings and their events. So how does that work? You're part of the Maltings event space and run your own series of summer events? That's not something I would have been aware of, by the way. Back to your point.
Well, and you wouldn't have been aware because it's never really been done here before.
Oh, right.
In terms of, there have been events here, but we're looking at income generation events to support the museum going forward and bringing a touch of flair to it, I guess, in terms of what we try to book in. So the first one we've just had this weekend was a safely done COVID safe event. It sold out 50 seated acoustic music playing in the garden, and it's just our space. And how that works with the Maltings, well, the basic answer is we just have to separate them and let people know that we're our own space. So you obviously have an amazing events program at the Maltings, and I work alongside their programmers to make sure what we do complements what they do, and vice versa, because they are two unique spaces in their own right, and we are one organization. So it's important that everything is coherent and what we offer to our audiences is varied.
Yeah, I saw that they're doing events on the lawn in front of their building. So the image I had was basically, a Maltings Museum program, but the actual event can be in the garden at the museum, or it can be in a Maltings venue. So that should add up to quite a powerful proposition. You said not many places do that, but it sounds a good way of leveraging the assets of both.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the Maltings have long been leveraging their asset in terms of events and utilising the spaces. And like you said, the performances out the front are another example of how they've looked at it and said, how can we utilise this space more? And to be honest, we've been discussing what can happen at the museum a bit more within the team over the last year or two. And it's only now, once we're back up and running, we've been able to kind of push and put those events on. And once you get a simple positive response of a couple of successful events, I think we're looking at a formula now where you will see more of an events program from the museum itself. And again, that ties in with the Maltings and supports what they do and vice versa.
Brilliant. This seems a long way from being a curator of a museum. You're enjoying that breadth and the development and the change in sort of business focus that produces?
Yeah, I think from a personal point of view, it's I see myself as a curator, but also I'm a jack of all trades here, and it would certainly be a better reflected in terms of if I was to put it down on an application for a job or something, I'd be able to talk about the skills as a kind of enterprising that I'm developing in this role, and I'm being encouraged to develop by Gavin actually, which is great. Because I don't think the traditional museum curator exists anymore in local history museums. It might exist in the British Museum, where you go to the ancient Greek section and you have someone with a PhD, but someone like myself, I have a background of museum and heritage, but I think I now sit alongside learning these business skills and enterprising skills, which I hopefully will help the sector develop and grow in a different way as well.
I think when we first met, you mentioned that there's also another listed building in the garden at at the museum. So it's quite a historic site. Are you able to say anything about that?
Oh yeah, so I think you referred to the coach house. The whole site itself, interestingly enough, if we just go back to the history of the house, it stretched all the way back to the river at one point, and over time, bits have been sold off, and there would have been hot gardens and a brew house within the entire property. And one building that remains from that, which is the very end of our garden now in our boundaries, is the coach house where the coaches would have gone in, and you can still see the two levels where the coach would have been left, and then nicer flooring at the top for the horses' hoofs. And within that coach house, it's a space that's quite empty, and it's never been looked at or developed in any way yet. Let's see what we can do with it. But for now, it's being rented out by a puppet maker, Max Humphreys. His actual main workshop is at the Maltings, and we're kind of the space for his oversized puppets. So if you see a dragon or a zebra walking up 38 from West Street, then you know where it's come from. You're not delusional or dehydrated.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a really professional puppet maker, isn't he, for big productions and things? Yeah.
I mean, I can't speak much about Max's business. I don't know, but what I see is simply amazing. It's the mechanics, but it's also the artwork that goes on with them as well, the final product. So
yeah, you see, what's interesting about sort of having a chat over a cup of tea or whatever it is that you find these corners of interest.
Yeah.
You wouldn't really know, would you? Walking along West Street, and we talked about the scaffolding, but there at the back of your property is a listed building, an old coach house, and bringing it right up to date, that activity going on. So that's fantastic. Well, look, what's the biggest issue you need to fix? If you could, have tomorrow the solution to everything, what's the biggest problem that you need to solve?
That's a really good question. I think when I sat down and thought about this, when you sent it through, it was difficult because you get 100 things that are on your head on a daily basis, kind of as the manager. But I think for me, the offer in terms of the galleries needs to be resolved at some point. In terms of, we have all these potential and great ideas, but they need to be resourced properly and funded well for us to produce something that we can be proud of, because there's not enough in here to bring people back on a repeat visit. And we know that, and it's not an overnight fix. So for me, it would be getting that sorted. But it's also to say that those exhibitions don't need to just take place in these galleries. We're interested in being experimental in where we take our exhibitions. We've recently secured £20,000, 15,000 from the Arts Council and 5,000 from another trust to do a project. And we're going to create a temporary exhibition that will tour the local area. And that'll be working with 6 different community groups, and they will co-curate it. So we're talking about an entirely different model of work for us. And if we can make this successful, I think it will really speak volumes about where we go in the future and how we work with our community.
Would I be stretching it a little to say that with so much pressure on development in the southeast, and Farnham's a good example of that, as we see all around us, that as we grow, as that development potentially both enhances or changes the environment, there's almost a need to celebrate even more that heritage, a heritage through artifacts and records and everything the museum represents. Is that something that should be promoted as Farnham itself develops and modernizes?
Yeah, and I think that's quite to ensure that we can retain relevance of the past with the present, and also open up discussion about the future. I was really interested. There's been a huge change in museum thinking. That it used to be stated that museums are neutral spaces. You're supposed to come here and you're supposed to learn a subject, walk away, and be able to kind of balance up your opinions. Whereas the thinking now is museums are not neutral spaces anymore. We are now looking at being places where you come in and we tell the story of Black Lives Matter, we tell the story of the LGBTQ community, and we give them a voice so that it stands up. And while we may not be able to do that with our old collection, you'd be surprised that people can look back through our collection and find and identify their own story within it. So it's really exciting. And as, like you say, as a place develops and new people move into the area, it's important they're able to connect with why the area is what it is today through those stories.
It's almost as though we need to put a card in every new home's letterbox to say, look, welcome to Farnham, but hey, visit the museum and learn about the place in time and space and heritage and history.
Well, I think we've just given 400 leaflets to a cause that's doing exactly that. So.
Oh, right. Okay, very good. Yeah, I'm behind the curve again, or
No. I'm
too
just
late on the idea.
one of those moments of smugness for me.
How would you like to see the museum? You've probably covered some of this, but one final phrase. How would you like to see the museum develop as an asset for Farnham? Um, Anything front of mind?
Yeah, a community-based museum is a simpler way to put it. We want to be active in how we talk to our communities. I want to know as many community leaders or people that identify themselves as a community within our community so that we can serve the needs of those in the area. I think it's the only way that we will exist into the future. And I strongly believe it's the best way a museum can serve the public.
So the best way a museum can serve the public. I'm interested. So what makes a successful museum? Do you have KPIs? Is it people through the door accessing the collections? From your professional viewpoint, what makes a successful museum, and therefore would be defining Farnham as a successful museum?
That's a good question. So KPIs are important, I feel, across any business, but how you might define them within a corporate setting as opposed to ours will be quite different, because yes, numbers through the door matter. They're the reason you can go to your funders and say, hey, we're relevant. However, that doesn't always mean in that when you put those numbers forward, you're telling the exact story of someone who came and emotionally connected with something and went away and decided to become a historian or decided to go explore more the workers' rights of the 1800s. That's intangible in certain ways and difficult. But in terms of a successful museum, it's a museum that's available to almost everybody and has something that's relevant to everyone. And that's easy to say, and that can be quite brushstroke, and that's quite challenging to achieve. But over time, you should be able to develop a resource that does that.
Do you think there's an unintended barrier about walking through the entrance door? I'm reflecting something personal in my own sort of psyche about this, that, can I just open the door and walk in? Is there a sort of a welcome that's evident and up front that says come in and see us? Is there a potential barrier there?
That's really interesting. And you refer to a physical barrier, but I actually think that's more of a psychological barrier.
Yeah.
I think it's more people ask themselves, is there something in there for me? What we have to do is find the answers to that question and find the relevance for everybody. And a good example of this can be recently we had a young lady came in, and her uncle was a shipmate during World War II, and she had a collection. He was a Farnham boy. She had a collection of the ship he served on, the newspaper clipping from when it sank and he died, and the letter from the king at the time, saying how sudden they were about his death. And her relevance to this museum now is a place of trust for her family, and we now take care of that history for them. But I can then use that to talk about, the importance of losing an 18-year-old man who was a son, a brother, an uncle, and relate that to others who may have lost other people within the community, within Farnham. And you can talk about grief. You can open up the entire conversation. So when someone comes to our front door, they know when they step in that they can relate to a story from the 40s about grief that touches on their current issues around grief.
Let me, focusing on Farnham, I think you're a relative newcomer to Farnham. You weren't living in Farnham before taking the role
I currently don't live in Farnham. I did 18 months in Farnham living in a prior role to this, actually, because I was just down the road in Hampshire. I currently live out of area. So I'd say between the role and living here, I've known the area for about 5 years.
Right. So there you are. What would you be saying to somebody thinking of moving to Farnham? What would you identify as its attractions, and maybe not its attractions, but how would you describe Farnham to somebody thinking of moving here or having just moved here?
Okay, good. A busy place, too much traffic, as we all know, but an overriding sense of community and willingness to help one another. I think I'm always astounded by the fact that people are always interested in hearing your ideas. Obviously, I spoke a little bit from a business perspective here, but there's always a willingness to support the museum. There's always a willingness to support us as a small team of staff. Richard, you and I have spoken personally about this, and I find it's a place with open arms. And if you do want to come here, I don't think you'll take long to find a place where you feel like you've settled in terms of, you know, a bookshop you want to go to, a knitting group you want to show up in, a yoga class. It's all here, and it's people that are going to help you find it as well.
But you have to reach out, don't you? You have to make that initial step yourself to walk through that door in the way that I've put it, and then you'll get a welcome. Yeah.
Of course. Of course.
Do you think we're going to get on top of our problems? You mentioned traffic and everything else that's going on.
I have no idea. I've got a museum to run. I haven't got traffic problems to worry about. I know that sounds silly, and it affects us all, but I can't think of the big picture right now in terms of traffic.
You're well focused on your role, Josh. That's good. Yeah. Well, look, just coming to the end now, and bearing in mind that, you know, trying to spread the word about visit the Farnham Museum. You know, it's one of our assets. Let's, as a community, make as good use of it as we can. So succinctly, why should I visit?
Okay, you should visit the Museum of Farnham because, like you said, it's important to understand where you come from and why this town exists where it does in terms of location and how it's become to be such an affluent area. I also think it's important to visit because we're a place of peace, a place where you can take a quiet minute, and it's a place where you might find something you didn't realise was here.
You'd like me to volunteer? Why should I volunteer?
Because volunteering is a huge asset to the museum itself, but also to the individual. If I talk about the organisation, we have 40 volunteers already, and quite frankly, without them, we wouldn't do what we do. They range from helping with the garden, helping with the cafe, running the front desk, collections work. We basically get the equivalent of an extra 4 or 5 members of staff across the week, I'd say. You know, or maybe part-timers, but they put incredible hours in. I think it's something like 120 hours a week of basic.
Yeah.
In terms of the individual, friends, and social network.
Well, good for the individual. I don't think we stress this enough, actually. You know, the more you put in, the more you get out, and volunteering is right at the center of that. So let me end on this. What's your most valued or prized item in the collection?
That's a really good question. I think the most prized or valued item in the collection is something that you find relevant yourself. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I can't give you an answer as a curator, but you know, for example, for me, there's a series of old photographs from a farm nearby, and it resonates with me highly because my granddad was a farmer. He may not be from around here, but the pictures themselves take me back to my days on his farm. So my point is that there's not one. They all have relevance and they all have high value significance. It just depends on the individual stood in front of them.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. What you find the most relevant must be the most valuable. Josh, thank you very much for your time. And can I finish by saying, look, thank you for what you do for Farnham. Thank you for keeping the museum, you know, vibrant and with ideas and plans and a vibrancy. And I hope we can fix somehow, sometime not too long in the future, the scaffolding problem. But if we've got one message, it's that for all of us that value Farnham, we should value the Museum of Farnham too. So, Josh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Okay.